Hello everyone, and welcome to The Current, the North Central Region Water Network's Speed Networking Webinar Series. The network is a university-led collaboration among 12 land-grant universities in the Upper Midwest. I am Rebecca Power, and I will be your moderator for today's session. Today we will be talking about communicating conservation and some foundational frameworks for us to consider, whether we're giving an elevator speech, doing social media, or longer forms of communication. Looks like we have a great group today. Excited to have you all. Our presenters are Kristin Runge from the University of Wisconsin Extension. Her presentation will be about how frames affect our perception of science issues. And Michael Dahlstrom from Iowa State University, and he will be talking about effective communication through telling stories. For our participants, we like discussion in these webinars. So please, as you see on our introductory slide there, please submit any questions that you have in the chat box. And that chat box is on the left-hand side of your screen, probably on the lower left. There's a gray box there. And we will be harvesting those questions, and we'll ask them of our presenters during the question and answer session at the end. So our presenters will be presenting for about 30 minutes, and then we will have time for discussion. So look forward to your questions and your comments. All webinars are archived for future reference, or for folks that weren't able to attend today, on the North Central Region Water Network website at northcentralwater.org and learn.extension.org with e-extension. All right, with that said, let's get to our presentations. And this is, so one of the purposes of the Current, our networking webinar series, is to help you get to know folks from across the region that can be references for you, have great information that can be of use in your programs or your research. Kristin Runge is one of those people. Give you a little bit of time to see her bio here. We will not read it, but we will take the time to have her tell us a little bit about herself as part of her presentation. So Kristin,
thank you.
It's all yours.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, you're good. Kristin, you're good. Okay, now we're not able to hear you. If you press, make sure to have your microphone on. There you go.
There you go. Now, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. All right, thank you. So as Rebecca said, my name is Kristin Runge. I'm with the University of Wisconsin Extension, based out of Madison, is where my home office is. And my background is in science, communication, and marketing issues. And I will talk today about framing issues, and specifically how the language we use to talk about issues affects how the people we're communicating with might think about those issues. So we'll just go ahead and get started right away. My contact information, if you have any questions, you want additional information, or to discuss something that you might be facing in your role at your institutions, my information is on this slide. It's kristin.runge@ces.uwex.edu. Feel free to tweet at me anytime too. I'm on Twitter a lot throughout the day. But to get started, I want to start out by looking at what is one of the foundational experiments or foundational pieces of information in the framing literature in communication. And it goes back to a couple of decades ago when Eamon Tversky and Daniel Kahneman performed a social science experiment in which they gave participants in this experiment a hypothetical situation. They said a pandemic is coming to a small town near you and is expected to kill 600 people. You, participant, must decide which treatments that we give to this town. And of course, this being social science, they divided the participants into group 1 and group 2, and each gave them different bits of information to consider. So group 1 got a treatment A that said 200 people will be saved if you chose treatment A. Group 1 decided between treatment A and treatment B, and treatment B said there's a 1/3 possibility that 600 people will be saved if you use this treatment, and a 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. So they got to ponder this. Treatment group 2 got to ponder identical treatments. Treatment C, 400 people will die of the 600. Treatment D said that 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. Now keeping in mind that the participants only saw group 1 or group 3. They only chose between A and B, or they got the choice between C and D. Because one of the things I'm guessing that everybody seeing this slide now, if you're not familiar with the experiment, has noticed is that treatment A and treatment C and treatment B and treatment D are absolutely identical. And so we might reasonably expect that people in each of these groups would make similar decisions. And of course, if they did make similar decisions, if the results between group 1 and group 2 were identical, we wouldn't be talking about it today. As it turns out, 72% of people in group 1 chose treatment A. They decided that the 200 people will be saved, that was the better course to take. People in group 2 decided that treatment D, or 78%, decided that treatment D is the better course of action. And in their view, the 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people die seemed like a more prudent course of action. So we have 2 different treatments here, 2 different groups, and very different decisions made by the majority in each one of these groups. This particular experiment has been performed again and again and again. I used to give it to students when I had this big lecture class of 100-some students. It was a really handy experiment to use to show them how social science experiments can be replicated. And without fail, every single semester that I gave this, we get similar results to this. So this is a really solid experiment. And the first insight that we walked away with, or that Tversky and Kahneman walked away with from this, is that human choice, the choices that you and I make, depends on how the outcomes we are presented with are framed. So the choice isn't really related to the absolute merits of one set of outcomes versus another. That was true, we would have seen identical decisions for the majority in the previous slide, but it's on how our perceptions are changed based on the way that those outcomes are framed in terms of words and presented to us. So this brings us to the very first definition of framing. And framing is how a given piece, this is one way of looking at framing at least, how a given piece of information is presented to an audience. So the words, the images, the way that we present that information to an audience. And what we learned from Tversky and Kahneman is that when we frame outcomes as a game, the majority decision typically is risk averse. So when we give somebody what we would call a game-framed outcome, 200 people will be saved, it prompts people to make a decision that is less risky than they otherwise would make. The opposite happens when we give people a decision that is framed as a loss. So 1/3 probability that nobody will die, but a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. So we've got a heavy emphasis on the loss involved in this decision in group 2. And when we frame it as a loss, the majority decision means that they'll take a risk. They're more likely to take a risk. So this very similar problem here, this identical problem, framed in 2 different ways, results in very different decisions by majority populations in each one of these situations. So when we're looking at framing, one of the first things we want to be aware of, and I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end of the presentation, is how the words we use frame the outcome of the decisions that we might be making people to ask. So gain, people are going to be risk averse. We frame it as a loss, people are more likely to take a risk. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, that's great, but a lot of the communication I do doesn't really involve giving people a choice in options. And indeed it's true that a lot of times we're just not talking about decisions in terms of making or talking about information in terms of making a decision. So the second framing definition that I want to offer today, not necessarily related to choice, but related to sort of broader communication when we're talking about issues in a broader sense than choice, is framing is a schema used to present, interpret, or organize information. So it's literally a framework within which we present information to an audience, and that audience then decides to, or doesn't decide to, they're not necessarily making a choice, but the audience interprets and organizes and takes in that information. So when we're looking at this framing, our insight, or this form of framing, the insights that we come away with are a little bit different. Frames in this instance, with this second definition, which is just a variation on the first, but the second definition help people communicate a couple of different things. It tells us why an issue matters. Framing can help us define an issue in different ways. It might tell us who or what's responsible for a course of action or an issue or a situation, and it might give us an indication as to what could be done. Oftentimes when we're thinking of frames in this way, we're thinking of the way that maybe media presents issues to us. And so I'll concentrate a little bit on common media frames. The first one I want to talk about, or the first category, is episodic framing. And episodic framing is when you might encounter a story in the news, 384 people sickened by eating hamburgers at Jack in the Box. With little or no context, just it appears to be straight information. The focus in an article that's episodically framed is on the here and now events occurred. It really doesn't place it in the context of anything larger. What we're more concerned with, and perhaps the work that you do, is when we use themes to frame. And there's a good article, or a good set of articles from the Pew Research Center. If you're into communication research, if this is your area, this is a broad field of research. But if you're just getting into it, the Pew Research Center has this article. It's about 18 years old now, so it's a little bit older, but still good. That is on framing the news, and it uses gives a lot of information about how news frames different stories. Some of the information that they pull out of this article is that we use conflict frames, and conflict frames are instances in which we have one or more groups that are at odds over an issue. Consensus frames are instances in which we might be reporting on how scientists or health officials or public officials commonly agree on a course of action. Conjecture frames are when we're speculating about what's going to happen in the future. Horse race frames on things like an election when we've got two competing groups who's reporting ahead. Trend stories reaction. I want to refer to some of these in the next few slides, so I'll avoid defining them all. One of the bigger issues in water, the more public issues in water, not necessarily one of the bigger issues, but one issue that's been in the news lately, you all might be familiar with, probably are familiar with, is the Standing Rock water protectors. And I want to use this issue to illustrate how some of these different frames are used in presenting information around an issue that has been kind of defined or framed as a water issue. So for our first frame, when we look at conflict frames in the news, or conflict frames when we're giving information out, conflict frames are frames in which the focus is on the conflict inherent in a situation or between key players of a situation. And by framing something as a conflict, we're encouraged to think of the winners, the losers, who might come out on top or who might not come out on top in a particular situation. The second frame I want to point out is wrongdoing exposed. And wrongdoing exposed is when information in the news is presented in a way that focuses on the uncovering of a wrong or an injustice. And that first slide we saw, or this previous slide we saw conflict between members of the Standing Rock tribe and police officers. In this we just have an image of who we presume to be a tribal member in a landscape that is kind of framed as a landscape from the area that's under negotiation or under contest right now. And the headline, "Former Interior Secretary Jewell says Army is reneging on its commitments in the Dakota Access Pipeline," and is going back on the word by an official. is an indication of wrongdoing. And indeed, if you read the story, it is about the uncovering of an injustice or perceived injustice in the situation. So wrongdoing exposed. The third frame might be an outlook frame, and an outlook frame talks about how an event fits into history. And so here we again have an image that is indicative of the area that is focused on. It's the landscape. The headline is the Dakota Pipeline's Last Stand, so hearkening back or recalling perhaps Custer's last stand, or any of the Wounded Knee, any of the other events that have happened in history. And then we look down at the text in the very first paragraph, the line that the real source of Native Americans' grievances stretched back more than a century to the original government incursions on their tribal lands and those earlier disputes over the rights to the land. So in this situation, we've moved from a conflict frame to a frame that outlines wrongdoing to one that places the events that are happening today in the context of a much larger issue that has occurred over time, and it extends beyond the Dakota Access Pipeline to include historical dealings that the government and the tribal nations have had relative to these particular areas and these particular issues in our history and in our place. So an outlook frame that places the event into history. As we're going through each of these frames, we're kind of seeing how we might ask different questions, or we might come to different conclusions based on the context that the frame is calling to mind for us. Personality profile is one that we often see when issues are in the news for longer periods of time, or when there is a particular personality that's a person that's famous or well known and is part of an issue or drawn into an issue. In this case, the young gentleman featured in the picture is Bronson Koenig, who's a guard for the Wisconsin Badgers. And if you're in Wisconsin and you're a basketball fan, you know who Bronson Koenig is, because he's a very successful basketball player. And so this article actually appears not in a national newspaper, but in the Players Tribune, which is a sports-minded newspaper. So personality profile is a profile of somebody in the news or somebody related to the news. And here this is an article that Bronson Koenig wrote about his experience at Standing Rock as a member of the water protectors and his time that he spent there. And the final frame that I want to present today is an economic frame. And an economic frame emphasizes the cost or the profits of an issue. And in this we see not an article, but a news report on a local station in North Dakota that looks at the cost of the Standing Rock tribe protest and how it might be paid for. So not looking at who's involved, not looking at the historical context of it, not looking at whether there was wrongdoing involved or the conflict, but looking at the economic issues or cost or profit related to this particular protest. So framing definitions 3, this brings us to our third idea here, is that framing also can involve selecting or emphasizing certain aspects of an issue. In the very first definition of framing, or way of framing we looked at gain framing and loss framing, and how these things might prompt us to make different decisions when we're faced with a choice. In the second, we looked at how we can frame overall issues related to the ways in which we provide context for that. And this final one is narrowing it down quite a bit to the way in which simple language choices can select or emphasize certain aspects of an issue. And the insight with this one is words sometimes work on our behalf, sometimes they don't. So a quick overview here, because I think I might be close to running out of time. One of the most famous examples of a switch in framing and a switch in attitude of global warming versus climate change. In the early 1990s, Frank Luntz, a Republican strategist, rolled out the term climate change because it tested well with audiences. Global warming prompted people to want to take action. Climate change felt like much less of a threat, and so he advocated strongly among Republican leaders for the change to use the word climate change instead of global warming, with different effects. One of the more famous recent issues that people often forget about until somebody like me reminds them I do some research on this issue is when ABC News did an investigative series on the use of lean, finely textured beef in hamburger and called it pink slime, which is obviously a negative description of what might otherwise by industry be termed an acceptable product. And then the third one I want to point out, another famous instance as well, is the estate tax. When it was renamed the death tax, the estate tax was a largely well-supported in public opinion tax placed on estates when they transferred from one generation to the next. But by renaming it the death tax, it became immediately, same policy, but it became immediately unpopular. So that change in wording not only changes attitude or emphasized different issues that led to attitude changes, but also in some cases polarized issues pretty quickly. So the takeaway for my section is, first of all, when you're presenting audiences with a choice, carefully consider how outcomes are framed. If we want people to make a risk-averse decision, we might want to present their choice in terms of a gain. If we need them to take a risk to do something, then we might present a choice in terms of a loss. The second thing, when we're communicating events or issues, these are complex things that we're communicating. We should carefully consider how the different types of frames we use direct audience attention to different aspects of the issue. And finally, when we're choosing words, so on a very small scale here, we should always carefully consider the ways in which language choices emphasize certain aspects of an issue. And with that, I think my time is just about up. So again, if you have any questions for me, my contact information is here. Please feel free to email me or give me a call. Or if you have specific issues that you'd like to talk over that you're facing with regards to maybe how language or how information can be framed and for complex issues, I'm here to help. So please give me a call.
Thank you so much, Kristin. And we will have time after Michael's finished to ask Kristin and Michael some questions. So please put those in the chat box if you have them, which is at the lower, should be at the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and we look forward to the discussion in a few minutes. Okay, so Michael Dahlstrom again from Iowa State University in the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication, and he's going to be talking about storytelling in communication. So go ahead, Michael. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you all for having me. Yes, so my name is Michael Dahlstrom. I'm going to be talking about telling stories, and I also am part of a science communication program at Iowa State. It's a group of colleagues here. We're very interested in science communication and getting information from expert to non-expert audiences, and so this is part of that. Okay, so to begin, I will tell you a little story. So I was having lunch with a friend of mine who happened to be a landowner, and I was telling him that I was working on this outreach project at the time about cover crops. And immediately he kind of chortled and just kind of said, oh yeah, that's the biggest waste of money. It's a stupid idea. And he kept going on about how much he hated cover crops. And because I was working on this outreach project, I was prepared with all these facts, and I said, well, you know, there's these long-term studies that find this about water retention and yields, and then we have this over here and this over here. And he waved it off and said, yeah, that's from those test plots. That's not what really is going to happen on the land. And I could tell that this was kind of a topic that we were done talking about. So as a parting shot, I said, well, you know, I did on this project interview a landowner down in southern Iowa who had some of the same concerns, and he decided to try cover crops, and he's done it for 2 years, and he says he sees a big difference. He can get into the field faster, he sees less erosion. And my friend looked up and said, really? Oh, well, tell me more about this guy. And that, I think, encapsulates what I'm trying to talk about, is that narrative is a story with specific characters who experience events over time, and it is a different format of communication. So as soon as I talked about that landowner, that particular landowner and his experiences, I shifted my communication into a narrative format, whereas everything before was facts and generalities. And it's narratives that I'm going to talk about today. So there's some literature that says narrative information is processed quite a bit differently than expository information. And so it says it's processed using different cognitive pathways. So one is called expository. That's where we process those general truths. So in general, these are the facts. Here's what we know about the world. But then there's another processing pathway that lets us understand very particular events and perceptions of what people would be feeling and what they would be thinking at the time. There's also studies that prove not only are these two different, but that narratives often get a leg up. So narratives are easier for people to comprehend, they're processed faster, they're recalled easier, and very often they carry greater weight in decision making. So exemplification theory talks about when you've got an expository and a narrative message together, what happens is even if they are contradictory, people tend to believe the narrative side more. Because there's so many biases with narrative, it's thought to be the default mode of human thought. So it's how we think about the world. We can train ourselves to think more expositorily, using logic, etc., and that's often what schooling is for. But when we relax and we kind of let our guard down, we slip right back into the narrative mode of thinking. So, knowing there are these benefits, where can you use stories? Well, about anywhere. So of course you can get them into written materials over here on the left. You can use them in presentations over on the right. And down at the bottom is just everyday conversation. So if you start noticing the difference between narrative and expository information, you can start just listening when people talk. And very often people fall back into the narrative mode whenever they want to describe something. So, how can you incorporate stories into your outreach messages? So there's lots of different ways, but I'm going to focus on two, hopefully, what I think are two easy ways to try and consider this. So one is trying to add anecdotes or exemplars to your message whenever you can. So what this does is this makes the abstract information that you're trying to talk about more concrete. If you give a particular character, it gives the audience someone to identify with. So maybe that's someone who is like your audience, and so they can put themselves into the shoes of your character. Narratives are attention-getting and persuasive, so a lot of times people like to hear stories. So instead of all this abstract information, as soon as you switch to a story, people lean in because it's something that's easier to understand. But this last bullet, I think, hits it the easiest. The topic that you want to communicate about is something relevant to your audience. Otherwise, you wouldn't be communicating it in the first place. So because there is some relevance, show it in action. So show that relevance happening to whatever the person is or whatever the experience that your audience would have. So I'll do a quick story again. So there is a project where I'm working with the Women Food Ag Network about making some conservation-minded brochures targeting women landowners. There's a large percentage of women landowners that generally are overlooked as an audience. So this is a group that's trying to do that. And we've made a bunch of materials here you can see. But for each of them, we usually try and put in what we call a neighbor story, which is purposefully putting an anecdote or a story in there of here is a landowner, possibly someone that you can identify with who has experienced whatever the topic is that we're talking about. So this one here is about soil health, and so it's a landowner who talks about the importance of managing soil health. We actually have a new brochure we're working on right now about CRP, and the whole brochure is modeled after an anecdote. So we interviewed 2 landowners who have different experiences with CRP. The brochure follows their story, and then there's facts kind of dangled on at important points within the chronology, but it's focused more on that. When we focus test these brochures, almost always these little anecdotes are very well received. And they're some of the things that people remember and that they say are very positive. So you can think about whatever it is you want to communicate, where could you incorporate anecdotes or exemplars into the message? So does your topic have obvious anecdotes? Well, maybe it does. If you're dealing with a person or a decision a person has to make, that's usually a pretty obvious place you can put anecdotes. If it's not an obvious place, you might have to get more creative. So where does my topic intersect with a person? Where would where would a person see these impacts? And then again, you can try and get an anecdote there. Another question is, do you have access to real stories, or do you need to fictionalize? So often, if it's something that's already happened, you can find people that have experienced this, and you can get their story. But maybe there's some change that's happened that you want to talk about, and so the impacts are not yet felt. So in that case, you might need to fictionalize the story. And as long as you don't claim that it's true, you can do that quite easily as a scenario. So you can say, because of these changes, we can assume, imagine that there's a landowner that does this. He would walk over here and might see this, so this would be the change. And again, you're creating a story based on what a person would experience. Okay, another thing to consider is how many anecdotes do you need to demonstrate what you want about your topic. So maybe you have a topic that one story is all it takes. Maybe you have a very complex topic. You need to show multiple anecdotes. So here's one that leans one direction. Here's one where the person had a different experience. You have to decide. And then it keeps going. So now that you kind of know what anecdote you could use, who would be the most relevant characters? There's usually multiple actors within the story. Where do you want to focus? What do you want to be the outcome of the story? Do you show a success? So someone enacts some practice, for instance, and is successful, or do you want to show a failure? And again, do you want the story to be representative of what happens, or do you want to show an extreme example of what could happen if you do or do not do whatever the message is? All of those would create very different stories, and you have to decide which one is most effective and relevant for what you want to do. Okay, that's number one. Number two, how do you incorporate a story pattern of organization into the stories? So this is the actual integration. Now you have the idea, you kind of know what story you want. How do you fit it in? Okay, so the things I want to talk about, you can work with chronology, incorporate some drama, and then these letters won't mean anything yet, but they will. So AAA versus an ABT structure. So first, let's just use an example. Let's say you wanted to talk about manure sampling and testing, and that's in the middle, and then you have all these topics circling it, and you could talk about any of them, you could put them in any order. This is kind of the dilemma you've got. So if we're doing a story pattern, you should think about who is a specific character that I can show experiencing this. And so if we have a whole room of people, they all might have different experiences, but boom, I want to talk about this one random person that's circled. All right, so that's my character. And then a chronological order. We have something in the beginning, and something comes next, and at the end we have this. So realize that the chronologic structure is just one possible structure. You could order it by what you think is most timely, or you could order it by what you think is most important. In this way, you're ordering it based on when something happens. All right, so let's put these together. We have this character in the plaid shirt who decides to test, takes a sample, and uses the results. All right, so now we've got a character, we've got a chronologic story, but it is pretty boring. So this is when we also have to come up with some aspect of drama to actually make the narrative somewhat interesting. So this is where we get these letters. So this model that I have here, deciding to test, taking a sample, using the results, is the AAA structure, which is and. Here's a fact, and here's another fact, and another fact, etc. This is actually a pretty boring structure. And if you have read Randy Olson's latest book, he says that instead of using the AAA structure, you should focus on an ABT, which is an and, but, therefore. So you've got a fact and you have a fact. That's basically your setting. You're kind of setting up the situation. But the B, the but, is your drama. This is where something has changed. Something is now not progressing in the normal flow. So but, we now have some conflict. And then the therefore is the conclusion that you want to communicate. That but is the drama, the problem, the challenge, confusion, what isn't known, what's missing. So that's the thing that draws people in, so they want to see how the narrative ends. So for instance, back to this story, we've got our character here. Now we've got the but floating over there on the right, so we have to fill that in. So we could say something like, we have, this is the setting that we know that you shouldn't put on too much manure, and there's ways you can test, and all the facts. But this person just really doesn't trust the test. So he thinks to himself, why don't I just apply insurance nitrogen? Why don't I just put on more than I should need and then I should be fine? So there's your but. So now you've got conflict and you've got a problem. And this is where you can come around with a therefore. And you could say, well, here are some facts. Therefore, look at the amount of money that landowners can save if they do test and they put on the right amount of nitrogen. And therefore, he decides to test. So now we've got the and the but, and the therefore. And of course, you can keep doing this. There's multiple places you can put in this conflict. Should I test, but what about the impact on productivity? Taking a sample, is it hard? Oh, but it's easy to mess up. And the more you can go, but the idea is it's not just a list of facts or just a description of what someone did, but there needs to be some conflict in there to make it interesting. So, how can you incorporate this story pattern of organization into your message? So first of all, you can think about who is your main character. Is it the audience? Is it that you want the audience to see themselves in it? Is the main character you, as maybe the communicator or maybe the researcher behind whatever the message is? Is there an obvious chronological order? If so, you've already got something set up to kind of give you a structure. And then, where's the drama? So what is the but in your story outline that creates the conflict that resolves itself in your favor and gets the message across? So in summary, narratives and storytelling offer cognitive benefits for extension communicators. There are a lot of good things that come out of using them. And if you do, you should consider incorporating anecdotes, exemplars. That's step number one. And then trying to come up with a story pattern of organization when crafting your next message. And so to return to my original story, I did tell the landowner about that farmer in southern Iowa and what he experienced. And the lunch was ended with the person just kind of saying, nodding his head, going, oh, well, okay, okay. And it turned out that he did try cover crops for the next 2 years. And I don't know if he's going to do it again this year. But he is now kind of the person in the area that people look at and say, well, why are you doing the cover crops? And then he's got a story to tell. So I'm not claiming that my lunch with him is the sole reason that he moved on to cover crops. But that was one moment where all of a sudden it changed enough that he considered learning more about cover crops, and then I thank whoever else he talked to that hopefully told them stories to get him to try it. So thank you very much. This is my information. I want to give credit to another colleague who I worked with on some of this information, Gene Goodwin, who is at North Carolina State. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Michael. Thank you so much. Thanks to both you and Kristin. And now we have a good amount of time, about 40 minutes, or I'm sorry, 20 minutes for questions. So if you have questions for either Kristin or Michael, you can go ahead and put those in the chat box. And while we're waiting for those, I'll ask a question. So Kristin, you know, you had those different categories of frames. I didn't have the chance to absorb them all while you're going through them, but I found myself wondering, and this is a oversimplified, I realize, but about, you know, is there anything we can say about frames that generally unite or frames that generally divide? And I thought I noticed some frames that seem to be more neutral, like just sort of just the facts kind of frame. But I was wondering if you could say anything about that, because obviously there's a fair amount of division out there on some water issues, and as extension folks, certainly we want to be presenting the facts, but also I would hope helping people to unite around solutions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things about frames with regards to broad issues that are complicated and for which there are a lot of different solutions to a problem is that a frame, even a consensus frame, might not necessarily unite people. who are coming from very, very different backgrounds. And the best example of this is climate change. You know, the consensus opinion among scientists is that human-induced climate change is occurring. And so we can use the consensus frame. We can talk about the unity among scientists. We can give people examples. We can show them statistics. We can interview experts, present them with all of the example statistics and testimony that would support the notion of the consensus that exists. But people from very strong ideological backgrounds that don't necessarily believe in that consensus opinion or buy into it. And it's hard for me to say believe in terms of science. Like, I cannot believe in gravity, and yet when I jump from a building, I'll fall. But they will motivate themselves to reason in ways that are inconsistent with the information that they're being presented in order to satisfy their internal belief structures. So frames aren't necessarily going to lead to a consensus. Rather, they can be used to highlight an aspect that maybe an audience hasn't thought about. And one of the ways to look at frames or to define frames is our way of highlighting different aspects of an issue, our way of providing a subtle way to audiences that this is a way you should think about this issue. You know, think about a water issue like this in terms of the conflict in the situation, or think about it in terms of the person that I'm profiling. So it takes that broad issue and it just narrows it down a little bit and allows us to present people with what might be more digestible forms of information. So I wish I could give you an easy answer to that. But does that answer your question, Rebecca? Or?
Yes, I knew. I mean, even thinking through my own question, I knew that there were issues with the way that I was thinking about it, but I thought it was worth asking, given sometimes what we're trying to do as extension educators. Thank you.
Yeah, and one of the ways that you can use frames is or be aware of the way that frames are used is to look kind of at the smaller scale in terms of the language we use. You know, the term pink slime is a great example of a frame around an issue that almost universally, regardless of ideology, provokes people to think in one way about that issue versus another. So when we're using our own language to describe the issues, you make sure we're using neutral terms or terms that invite people in or don't push on those ideological buttons in advance.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And then, Michael, there's a question for you from Jessica Pope, and she asks if you have found that there is a better type of media, brochure, newspaper article, radio, etc., that works best for adding anecdotes, or can you tailor to all types?
Well, I would say that they're actually, they don't align. So the narrative is a format that you could fit into any medium. The differences with the different types of media is you just have different audiences that will use different types. You have different expectations. So for instance, in a brochure, you might put an anecdote in there, but people can look at a brochure in any order they want. They probably jump around, they look at the visuals first and move around. Within radio, you have more control because you can decide where within that broadcast you want to put the anecdote. So they change that way, but it's still, whatever medium you use, it's still the fact that you could start broad using expository processing, and then, now that we've talked about that, I can prove it, and I'm using air quotes here to say prove, but I'll prove it by giving you a story. And here's a very specific example that shows that larger theme in a way that has all the benefits we talked about. And actually, I do see a question here from Kate McFarland about case studies, and I just wanted to say a quick thing about that, is that basically case studies would be another example of a narrative or an anecdote. And so I used anecdote exemplar, but you can also use case study as the same thing. Because almost always a case study is a very specific example of some larger thing that you're trying to exemplify. So a case study would be an example of using an exemplar.
Excellent, thank you. And then Jane, hello Jane. Elder has a question about the role that deeply held values play in frames. And I suspect there could be, Michael, you could also say something about the role that values play in narratives and stories as well. And she says freedom fries was one example that probably didn't work, but political frames invoke values all the time. So Kristin and then Michael.
Yeah, our deeply held values affect just about all of the communication, at least sometimes it seems that way, all of the communication that we take in, particularly when we're confronted with issues about which we have little prior knowledge. So an issue that we don't know a lot about. Kind of our natural state is to struggle to understand a new issue when it's presented to us and place it within the context of what we already know. So we may rely on, religious values. We may rely on political ideology in terms of conservative versus liberal ideology, or fall back on party identification, Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, whatever those internal identities might be. So when we are presented with that frame, no two people, when we're looking at large thematic frames, no two people will look at the same exact piece of information and come away with the exact same idea about what should be done. Well, they might arrive at the same idea of what should be done, but they might get there through different pathways and in their internal structures and by using their predispositions and their value filters. The thing that we can do when we're communicating is be very careful that the words that we're choosing aren't necessarily politically connected or ideologically connected in some way, and as neutral as possible, and just to be really aware of what structures might exist ahead of time in order to minimize that. Michael?
Yeah, and I'll follow Kristin's idea for a second. So I think you're exactly right about watching the political language and everything, but I also think we have to acknowledge that we can never get away from these deeply held values. So even if you have a statement of fact about the science, and this is what the studies show, depending on the values that the audience brings to that, they will interpret that very differently. And there's a line of studies by Kahan that finds that for a lot of contentious issues such as climate change and GMO, the more knowledge that people have, the more polarized that they become. So it's not that that one side is misinformed and the other side is knowledgeable. It is that the people that have deep enough values that they really care, they're going to apply the science in ways that reinforce their values, and it actually pushes them apart. And narrative, one reason that sometimes scientists and science communicators squirm a little bit when I talk about narrative is it's a completely subjective communication format. So it's getting very far away from that objective ideal. Because when you create a narrative, just like we talked about, there's all these choices you have to make. Do I do it from the eyes of the landowner, or do I do it from the eyes of the researcher? Do I tell the story starting at this point and I end here, or do I start in here and here? Do I show success? Do I show failure? All of those choices are subjective that you, the communicator, have to make in order to achieve whatever goal you have and to do it effectively. But when you tell the story, you don't justify any of that. All of that becomes basically hidden because you don't tell a story and then have a caveat to say, and by the way, here's why I chose to create it the way I did. You don't. You tell the story, and so all those subjective choices are hidden. So yes, there's values hidden even in the way the communicator decides to incorporate anecdotes if they do.
Okay, thank you both. And I'm thinking of an example like aquatic invasive species, for example, where we know we're after a particular change in the way that people are doing things. So that's different than a goal to inform. It's a goal to change behavior. And I don't know if do you have any additional thoughts about frames or narrative for behavior change? Particularly, I'm thinking of our extension colleagues or folks that want to, try to maintain some level of, not getting caught in one particular political frame or the other. Any thoughts about how to use the thoughts that you've shared with us today in terms of a behavior change situation?
So I would go back to that very first definition of framing or aspect of framing, because they're all within the same definition there. That when we're asking people to take an action, and taking an action often comes down to making a choice to take the action versus not take the action. And so if I'm recalling my aquatic invasive species training correctly, I'm going to wash off the bottom of my boat, and I'm going to pump out the bilge and clean the wells out for when moving from one lake to another, among many, many other actions that I would take, which is thinking as a boater what I would do. So framing that in a way that highlights the outcome that I want. And if I believe that this is a risk minimizing, that for me as a boater to take those actions, I am averting, I am minimizing a risk to the lake that I love, I might frame it as a gain frame. 200 lakes can be saved if you take this action. And I might think, and I'm not saying that that's the way to do it. I would really have to think about the message and the context. Sorry, my phone's ringing in the background. The message and the context that would require for those particular audience members. Also, I'd be really interested actually in how to place that in a narrative and how that might play out in terms of persuasive communication.
Well, I would say you need to take one step back and decide what the goal of the communication is. So like you said, we're moving past just informing all the way to persuasion. So narrative has a history of spanning this whole range. So I'd say the most extreme would go more toward entertainment education, where the whole point of creating a narrative is to get you to do something or to change your behavior in a way that you don't even realize that you're being persuaded. So there's a lot of health communication campaigns that use these narratives basically to try and covertly persuade you. So I would say in the case that you talked about, you could create, if your decision was, I want to create a persuasive narrative, then you could make a narrative where a character, probably someone that your audience could identify with, you show that character in the beginning having the same viewpoints as whoever you want to influence, and then over the case of the narrative, the person learns to do some better behaviors and then enacts those behaviors and something good happens to them. And at the same time, you could have another character who chooses not to enact those behaviors and something bad happens to them. Within kind of that health comm literature, that's kind of the classic thing that they do, is they show the good behavior, and good again is the one I'm doing in quotes because that's what the communicator has decided they want. You show that behavior succeeding and you show the other one failing, and because it's got the narrative, it's got the persuasion, and it's got the credibility, and often people start to accept it because they don't think they're being persuaded. They think it's just a story, so my guard is down and I'm not trying to counter your arguments. Now the danger is there's been studies that show once an audience realizes that they're being what they would think is manipulated through narratives, then there's a pretty big pushback. So as long as, let me say it this way, if the audience does not expect that you're trying to persuade them, and you use a persuasive narrative and they don't realize it, you're probably going to have a good effect. But if they do not expect to be persuaded, you try and persuade them and they see through what you're doing, chances are your message is going to be rejected much worse than if you hadn't used the narrative in the first place. So it's really this balance between expectations of the audience and the goals of the communicator.
Thank you, very helpful. We have a couple questions related to fear in communication. The first one is from Doug Jensen, who says to Kristin, without going political, we've learned from the last election that the use of fear can be used with great success to motivate support. Generally speaking, communication research shows that the use of fear doesn't work very well. Have we learned anything from the last election? And do you have any insights into how fear tactics could be used to help gain greater support on water protection? Has it been a game changer? And then just to add to that quickly, Jessica says again, the Clean Water Act was passed based on fear of how bad water quality had gotten and what could happen if it continued. I would say that it is that fear is a part of it. Maybe just not use it as a straight fear, but it would be shown as an example of a far extreme of what could happen. So any comments, first from Kristin and then from Michael?
Yeah, fear is a powerful motivator. Emotion is powerful. We don't fully understand it as well as we would like to in communication. There's quite a bit of literature on emotion. The thing with fear is that while it is powerful, it's also somewhat unpredictable. We're not exactly always sure the direction people are going to go when we push that fear button. So I would hesitate to advocate using fear. Rather than that, I think it's easier to talk in non-emotional ways about the risks and benefits of particular decisions or courses of action, and highlighting what might the risk be to an individual or his or her community. And there's a lengthy literature on risk communication that can help shape those particular messages. And risk differs a little bit from fear in that risk hopefully allows people to somewhat rationally approach making a decision without becoming alarmed to the point that short circuits good cognitive thought and work towards something. How about Michael, what do you think about fear and narrative?
Well, I think fear is another thing that you can try and use, but what I was going to kind of extend to is fear was definitely part of the election, but I think another one that is relative is identity. Mm-hmm. So it comes down to the value of this is who I am, and if I can see something that reinforces what I consider important for my identity, then the candidate can do one thing and both sides interpret it completely differently. But that's something that we could use for audiences as well. So if you're talking to, again, let's say you're talking to a farmer, more than just providing the facts or even coming up with the story, it might be useful to say, okay, so how does this particular audience identify with themselves? What is it that's important to them? They are this type of person. And then you can create the narrative, or you can use the frames like Kristin was talking about, something that shows it's not just that we want you to do this or not do this, but if you do this, it reinforces you as this type of person. And again, that takes more audience analysis to know what your audience values and how they identify. But if you know that, then again, you can frame and use the stories in a way that reinforces what they already want to be.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. Great presentations, great information. And I'm just going to back up for a second. So as both of our speakers said, feel free to follow up with them after this webinar. You know generally what they have to offer, which I think is a lot, and it's really a critical topic that we all need to know more about. And thank you all to our participants. Just to let you know, our next session in March is in honor of World Water Day and the water and wastewater theme. Our topic is on-site septic systems, research, outreach, and management. Again, that'll be on March 15th. It's always the third Wednesday at 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern. Our presenters for March will be Dave Gustafson from the University of Minnesota and Steve Safferman from Michigan State, and maybe one other person. Stay tuned. So thanks again so much for joining us. You can access this webinar later at northcentralwater.org or learn.extension.org. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.